Hi everyone, and happy Wednesday. Last week I painted a raven, and before painting my raven I shared a little bit of information on a subject near and dear to my heart, and that is positive uncertainty. And I shared how positive uncertainty, having the ability to move forward even though we are uncertain of the end result of what we are trying to achieve, can be a very powerful tool. This week, sort of in line with what I shared last week, I want to talk a little bit about focus. But before I do that, I want to share a little story to sort of illustrate what I am going to share about focus. So many years ago, I was out riding my bicycle in a town in Quebec that I didn't know very well. I had not been living there for very long, and I wasn't very familiar with the area. And as I was riding my bike, I got to this section where there was a very narrow bridge. And on this narrow bridge, there was very little room for bicycles because there was not much of a shoulder. There was a bit of a sidewalk, but the sidewalk was sort of narrow and very high up. So there was a lot of traffic, and I felt like the best place for me to be was on that little narrow sidewalk to cross this bridge. I hadn't been riding my bike at that point for very long, and I was feeling a little uneasy on the bike. And then here I was on this narrow, tall sidewalk that I had to cross in order to get to the other side of the bridge. So I went about it very clumsily, and as I was riding my bike over this bridge, I kept looking at that railing on the side of the bridge, and instead of looking ahead of me to where I wanted to go, I kept focusing on the railing, and I kept thinking to myself, don't hit the railing, don't hit the railing, don't hit the railing. So, this may come as no surprise to anyone out there that, of course, what did I do? I hit the railing. In fact, I hit the railing so hard that I hugged it like it was a long lost friend. It was not a good moment for me. Thankfully, I didn't get too hurt. I more had a bruised ego, I think, than anything else, because like I mentioned before, this happened on a busy roadway with a lot of people around. So yeah, not my finest moment. But it was an important moment for me because after this happened, I sort of analyzed everything that had taken place, and I remembered my thinking. I kept focusing on the very thing I didn't want to happen, which was to not hit that railing. And if I had just focused on going straight ahead, I probably would have gone over that not so long little bridge without any problems. So I'm bringing up the topic of focus today because it goes right along with positive uncertainty. When we are painting and we are feeling unsure of what is going to happen, it's important to focus on where we want to go. So focusing on finishing or reaching the finish line rather than focusing on the things that we do not want to do, such as ruin the painting or make a mark that is not going to be beautiful, or maybe add some colors that might turn muddy. So if we focus on the things we want to achieve rather than the things we would prefer not to achieve, we're more likely to get to the end of our painting process successfully. Now, with that, I feel like it's important for me to also say that focus needs to be followed with action, because focus without action is just a wish. So we can focus on creating the painting we hope to create. But if we don't take action, that painting is never going to come to life, right? So it's very important when we are working that we make sure we don't remain paralyzed with that fear of not succeeding. Because again, we're focusing on the thing we really do not want to achieve. You know, life has this beautiful way of teaching us lessons that will serve us for a good long time. And that lesson on focus for me has served me for a good long time. So as with painting or anything else in life, focus without action is just a wish. So if you wish to create beautiful art, it needs to come with action. If you want a certain outcome for this election, it needs to come with action too. So if you live here in the US and you are hoping for a certain outcome in this election, the best chance for you to get it is to get out and vote. And I just voted this past weekend and I am feeling very pumped and hopeful, let's just say. So anyway, without any further ado, I'm going to get back to my painting process because my painting is not quite finished yet. So I want to focus and I want to get into action so that I can get this painting completed for you. And I hope you'll enjoy. It's a textured abstract and I am really loving the colors on it. I'm loving the textures and I hope you'll enjoy watching the process. Thank you so much for being here with me. And thank you for all the kindness, love, and support you send me every week. It means the world to me. It truly does. I started my process this week by cutting a piece of watercolor paper to 10 by 10. And I adhered the watercolor paper to a piece of cradle board, and I did that using some modeling paste. The next part of my process, I'm cutting another piece of paper, watercolor paper, and this time I'm going to cut it to 9 by 9. I don't know that this is absolutely necessary. You can figure out for yourself what you would prefer to do, but for me, I was trying to experiment with an idea that came to me. I don't know that it necessarily worked out, but it started the ball rolling, and sometimes that's the most important thing, to just get the process going. Over this part of my painting process, because I am working on a textured painting, I am simply working on building my textures. And so I'm experimenting with some different ideas, and as I go along, I'll decide whether I want to keep these ideas or if I want to make any changes. That's basically how I always work. It just feels better for me to work that way. I probably won't show the entire process of me building these textures. I understand that it can be difficult to see what I'm doing, especially when I'm working white on white. And so I will show the essential and then give you a chance also to think of the different ways you would love to build your textures, because there really are so many possibilities.
One thing I do find important to mention when working with different mediums like this to start building up textures is that it's important to let whatever textures you've created dry if you want to move on to adding anything over them. Seems like it would make sense, like it's common sense, but if you're not used to working with these mediums, they don't, of course, dry super fast, especially because they're typically applied, or I apply them thick in a thicker manner. And the thicker the medium, the longer it's going to take to dry, of course. And if there's something in what I've created that I absolutely love and I don't want to ruin, the best way to protect it is to just make sure it dries completely before I add anything else to it. And usually it's good to go. And then, of course, once I'm satisfied with the textures I've created in my background, I am going to want to let everything dry completely before I start adding paint to it. as if adding all that texture to the paper wasn't fun enough. I find that when it's time to start adding the paint, ugh, I get really excited. And I guess that's because all those textures I've built and worked on for a little while are now finally going to start having a little bit more dimension because I'm going to start adding color. And the color helps me to also connect more with those textures that I've created on my background. And so it's going to help guide me in my process. When it comes to adding a second color after adding that blue, I am basically going with the idea that I want the colors to blend. I am not directly adding a new color onto the blue, but I am adding color next to it. And when the two colors touch, they are going to blend into one another. And I really love the effects that this creates. And so I prefer to work wet on wet when I'm doing a textured painting. I find it adds a lot more interest to the painting because the colors spread, and sometimes some new interesting colors that go really well with the colors that are already there in the painting get created as well. So this can be exciting and a new chance to discover things that your supplies can do. After letting the first layers of color dry, I generally love to start intensifying my colors on the subsequent layers. And oftentimes this means I just work with the same colors that are less diluted with water. And sometimes it means I'll actually start to shift some of those colors and I'll either add something new on top or I'll use some of the colors that are in the background in different locations. It really just depends on what my intuition is nudging me to do. Just as I did with my first layer of color, I let the second layer of color dry completely before coming back in to add some more color. I also, when I came back in, used my mop brush to add a little bit of water over the areas where I wanted to add some color. I'm coming in now with indigo, and this is a dark color that I'm hoping will basically flow into the little cracks in my texture and will help those textures pop even more because the indigo will create some contrast with the colors that are on top. And so adding the water makes this more easy. If I had not added water, the indigo would have had a tendency, instead of just going into the little cracks, the indigo would have had a tendency to sit on top of the other color and probably cover it more than I actually wanted to. So having added the water ahead of time before adding my paint is making this process way easier. I'm really loving my textures and I'm loving the colors in the painting, except for the yellow that's in those irregularly shaped squares. It's too bright and it doesn't seem earthy enough for the rest of the painting. So eventually I'll figure out a solution for that. But for now I'm going to focus on doing other things in the painting to really make the textures stand out more. And as I go along, I'm sure I'll figure out a solution to all that. And sometimes it just needs a little bit of me experimenting and playing and maybe adding a little bit more color and maybe adding different color. We'll see. But yep, these 5 irregularly shaped squares are not sitting overly well with me right now. And that's okay. It's my intuition is speaking to me and guiding me towards the things that I am actually really appreciating about my painting. And it's helping me make these decisions that will get me to completing my painting. And so all the information coming to me, even the things that are coming to me that are telling me what I don't like about the painting, all of that is good information for me to take note of. It's helping me in my process. With watercolor, everything seems to dry, or no, doesn't seem, it does. It does dry much lighter than it was when the watercolor is wet. The colors look a lot more rich and intense when the paint is wet. And it seems a little deflating for me almost every time. But then I always find ways to work through this, and it's usually just a matter of coming back in with some more paint and adding a little bit more pigment to these areas that seem more flat. Because the colors have dried lighter, even though I added some darker values, they don't seem to be quite as dark and contrasting now as they did when the colors were wet. So working again towards intensifying these colors should help, but then there's always ways towards the end of the process of intensifying the colors as well. So here I'm attempting to knock back that yellow, which I find too bright and sort of not really fitting well with the rest of the painting. I'm using some indigo in a very light wash to just go over it again to try and knock that yellow back, but it's not working nearly as well as I'd like it to, so I'll come up with something else. But for now, um, I think it was just worth trying. And, you know, in any painting, if there's an area that you're not 100% sure about, you can't screw it up more. That's kind of how I look at it. I just feel like if I can't screw it up more, then it's worth me just trying to see what else I could do. And if I like whatever else I do, great. If I don't, then there will be another solution somewhere along the way. But the important thing is to not give up, because as soon as you give up, you cannot find that solution. With the exception of these yellow irregular squares, which I actually at this point like a little bit better than I liked them initially, I feel like I'm satisfied with everything that's in there. I will still work on changing those squares eventually, but for now I'm going to keep working on intensifying my contrast. And so I've pulled out my brush pen, and this is a brush pen that has black ink. And then I'm using a damp brush to go over the black ink. So I'm using the ink in those areas where I want to make the shapes stand out. It creates sort of like a shaded effect around the shapes, and this is going to help to make those shapes stand out from the rest of the painting. I've pulled out two of my metallic paint sets and I'm going to start playing with gold. I want to use this gold, the first one I'm playing with here called Inca Gold, to see if I can knock those yellow squares down a notch and actually feel better about them. And already, having just applied a couple of strokes of this color, I'm feeling it way more. It is fitting with the painting a lot more, at least in my mind and in my impression, because it's a gold that's a little bit more on the neutral side, and I think that that is what this painting needs. That gold, which was initially New Gamboge, that I applied initially, was just too yellow, and it was too almost like an orangey yellow and not so well suited for the rest of the colors in the painting. In hindsight, probably it would have been nicer for me to just stick with adding some raw sienna like I had in other parts of the painting, but I don't regret having made this decision because it's helping me work through this process and find solutions to areas of the painting that I was struggling with. And that's never a bad thing because it's helping me learn something that will definitely be useful to me in the future. Just to bring in a little bit more light color contrast, I'm going to add this color called Crystal Silver. And it's sort of like a metallic white of sorts, and I think it'll do exactly what I'm hoping it will do, and that's just to add a little bit more light contrast in the painting. I'll add it here and there in these little tiny squares, and I'll also add it to my focal point. Okay, this project has been a labor of love for me. And with these final additions of the crystal silver, I'm ready to call the painting finished. And if you stick around till the very end, I have some, well, what I think is pretty exciting news for you. Working like this on a textured painting with my paper adhered to a cradle board was the best way to do this. The cradle board makes it so that the paper cannot buckle, and I think there's no better way to work on a textured painting than to do exactly that. I don't think there's any better way to appreciate the textures in a painting like this than to have a closer look from really close. From up close, you can see how all the different colors play so well together and how the textures really pop with these additions of color and all the contrast in the painting. I really love working with watercolors over watercolor paper, but there's something about adding texture to that watercolor paper that is just a yes, please. I love it.
Okay, so if you stuck this out with me till the very end, I have some exciting news to share with you. And I could have shared it at the beginning of my video, but I really wanted it to be shared with those of you who I know stick it out every week. I figured you should be the first to know. My website is finally live. Yes, I am so excited about it, and I will share more details about the website itself next week in the introduction to my video. But for this week, please know that you can find a link to my website in the video description below. And I hope you'll have a chance to go check it out and share your thoughts with me. There may be some little kinks to work out along the way. It's just going live and you are the first people to know. And so I am just choosing to trust and embrace whatever may come and know that in time these kinks will be worked out. So hopefully there won't be too many kinks, but if there are, please be patient with me and my website, and thank you for making the time to visit it. And as I say every week, thank you so much for joining me on my creative journey. I hope you really enjoyed watching this week's process. It was a lot longer than what you actually get to see because it was over about 3 hours of footage actually, and a lot of video editing needed to be done in order to make it a reasonably sized video for you to watch. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me via the comments or via email. I always love hearing from you. I hope you have a wonderful week, and remember, happy creating!